the he said, she said till the cows come home. And she's told you things that I fundamentally disagree with.
Okay.
And all I'm doing now is defending myself.
Okay.
Friends, it's me, Meerab, APCO, Starspill USA, Pay. Welcome, Kody Hun. And today I take you into a scene so taut with tension, it felt as though the very air might split. The moment when the gavel had yet to fall. But the fate of an entire family was already hanging by a thread. Order in the court, the judge's voice rang out, crisp and commanding, snapping every head in the room towards the bench. Voice so firm it could make the most hardened man shrink, and the youngest child draw a sharp breath. In that sudden stillness, every small sound swelled unnaturally loud. The faint scrape of shoes on the polished wooden floor, the whisper of papers being shuffled, the low hum of the lights above. At the defense table, David's hands clamped to the edge as if the oak might anchor him in the storm. Knuckles bone white, chest constricted as though a rope had been drawn tight around his ribs. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of the gallery. Friends, estranged relatives, and strangers alike, watching with the hungry curiosity people reserve for public tragedies. Across the aisle, Alina sat composed in a navy blazer, her hair pulled back to severe precision, her gaze fixed on the documents before her as if reading them with enough intensity might shield her from the need to look at him. After 2 decades of marriage to children, countless shared mornings and whispered nights, she was no longer a wife in his eyes, but a stranger who had arrived not to reconcile, but to fight. And it had not always been so. Barely a year earlier, they had been in the kitchen discussing the silly little items each might pack for a family holiday. Their laughter drifting through the warm air of a late evening when the telephone rang, with the call that broke that version of their life forever. David's father was dead, taken suddenly by a heart attack at 74. Grief has a way of reshaping people in quiet, irrevocable ways. For David, mornings became hollower without the familiar ring of his father's daily calls. For Alina, something within seemed to draw inward, her manner sharpening, becoming guarded. 3 weeks later, in the solicitor's office that smelled faintly of dust and strong tea. The will was read. The family home, acres of farmland, rental properties, and investments, not merely wealth, but a living legacy. A promise that the Browns would always have a home. Mark, David's younger brother, wasted no time demanding that the estate be divided and sold so they might take their shares. David refused, determined to keep the land for Lily and Noah one day. Alina had been silent in that meeting, giving only a faint nod, that David mistook for agreement, but which, in truth, masked her own intentions. The true blow came weeks later, quietly, cruelly. One evening, David returned from work, slipped off his tie and saw an envelope on the kitchen table. Expecting another property statement, he opened it casually and the ground beneath him seemed to vanish. A petition for divorce, a petition for full custody, a petition for sole control of the estate. He read the words twice, slowly, yet they remained unchanged. The woman who had promised him fidelity through better or worse was taking him for everything. That night, the house was silent, save for the hum of the fridge. Lena slept in the guest room, and David did not knock, did not ask why, for somewhere deep inside, he already knew. This was not about land, it was about control, trust, and a darkness yet to reveal itself. Now, weeks later, in court, the full weight of it pressed upon him. This would not be a quick hearing, but the start of a long, grinding war. The bailiff called the case number, papers whispered. The judge, peering over the rim of his glasses, looked between David and Alina like a man opening a book whose ending he already knew would be tragic. David's lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Keep your head down. Do not respond, no matter what they say." Across the aisle, Alina's lawyer's suit, razor sharp, tone icily professional, rose to paint David as unfit to manage the estate, to raise the children, to be trusted with anything at all. Citing instability, emotional absence, and dubious financial behavior, never once meeting his gaze. David's instinct was to stand, to tell the court about Mark's greed, about his pressure to sell the estate. But each time he stirred, his lawyer's hand pressed firmly on his arm. Not yet, our turn will come. The courtroom transformed. His private heartbreak into public theater, where every past argument, every missed anniversary, every careless word was now a weapon. The gallery absorbed it greedily. Cousins who had taken sides, neighbors who had abandoned their work for. The spectacle. Cameras were banned inside, but beyond those doors, reporters swarmed the steps, desperate for the next headline. When their eyes met, Elena's were as cold and closed as a locked gate. The judge broke the building tension, warning that he would not permit the chamber to descend into petty sniping. They were here for custody, for facts, for the rightful care of the estate. If they could not restrain themselves, he would decide matters without another word of testimony. The threat hung in the still air. David nodded, swallowing his fury. Elena sat unmoving. At recess, David stepped out into the brittle winter air, through the gauntlet of reporters calling his name. Past the onlookers snapping photographs, past the whispered repetition of his name as though it were a character in a television drama. He lit a cigarette he had promised himself years ago he would never touch again, thinking, this isn't about winning, it's about surviving. And that was only the first morning. The true fight, the accusations, betrayals, and custody battle lay ahead. Back inside, pale sunlight slanted through high windows, laying long, thin shadows across the gleaming floor where dust motes drifted like lazy spirits. David sat rigid, eyes fixed on the world grain of the table as his lawyer's pen clicked. Steadily, a false metronome of calm. But calm was impossible, for David could sense something coming. He saw it in the way Elena's lawyer kept glancing at the heavy leather briefcase by his chair. When the judge nodded, the lawyer rose, immaculate and smooth-voiced, yet with an edge of malice. He declared they had received documents revealing disturbing patterns in David's handling of the estate. Patterns that questioned his financial integrity and his ability to act in his children's best interests. From the briefcase came a thick, navy folder that landed on the evidence table with a weighty thud. David's pulse quickened. He had never seen these documents, but recognized their nature. Bank statements, lists of transactions, property accounts. The bailiff carried them to the judge, who leafed through with deepening severity before passing copies to both legal teams. Drawing the stack towards him, David's eyes caught on the first page and his stomach dropped. There was his name heading. A list of withdrawals he had never made, sums of £15,000, £20,000 each to the same offshore account. The amounts ringed in red ink like open wounds. He turned page after page, his hands trembling, finding dozens more, all damning him. But he knew the truth. He knew whose shadow this was. Mark, his younger brother, co-signer on several accounts their father had set up years before. The man who had urged selling from day one, always chasing the easy money. That shadow now threatened to swallow everything: the land, the children, the legacy. And as David sat there in the chill silence of the court, surrounded by the low murmur of spectators and the faint scent of polished wood, he realized that what lay ahead was not merely a fight for property, but for the truth itself. And that truth would need to fight harder than it ever had before.
Looking in Montana, and then we were looking in North Carolina, and that one piece sold before we came. I know. Anyway, so we put an...
David's eyes moved steadily across the bank statements, each transaction revealing a pattern too precise to be coincidence: money withdrawn on the very days he had been out of town, buried in meetings, or preoccupied with the children. Was calculated, deliberate, and, to his growing dread, highly effective. For Elena's solicitor was framing it as his crime, and now, summoned to testify, she approached the stand with slow, deliberate steps. Her heels echoing against the polished marble, not once glancing at him as she swore to tell the truth. Her solicitor's voice, gentle yet edged with purpose, asked why she had felt compelled to produce the documents, and in that measured, almost sorrowful tone, She spoke of initial doubt giving way to certainty, of missing funds and the shadow. They cast over the children's future if he could treat the estate like a personal account. What would stop him from touching their education funds, their home? And David felt each word land like a fresh wound, for she was not merely accusing him of financial impropriety, but of being a father unworthy of trust. The questioning pressed on, probing how he had reacted when confronted. And Alina, pausing, admitted he had denied it, but denial was not proof, and the withdrawals had continued, a statement that hung in the air like a verdict. David's counsel rose for cross-examination, but first sought his silent consent strike hard or hold back. And with the image of Lily's bright smile and Noah's shy laugh in his mind, David knew that attacking Alina too fiercely risked casting her as a victim, and in custody battles, perception was everything. So his solicitor asked only the bare minimum. There was no direct evidence, was there? To which Alina reluctantly admitted no, prompting an abrupt close that the public gallery misread as surrender. Whispers rippled immediately, his cousin murmuring to a friend, a reporter's pen scratching more fervently. And though the judge called for order, the damage was done, the seed of doubt planted not only in the court's mind but in everyone's. As David sat numb, he recalled a conversation months earlier in the sitting room, documents spread before them. Mark having just stormed out after another quarrel over selling the estate. And Alina, with measured tone, had said, perhaps Mark was right, perhaps they should sell. To which David had replied with bitter laughter that it would be a betrayal of his father's life's work. And though she had said nothing then, he wondered now if her silence had been the moment she chose, her allegiance, as the day's proceedings dragged on. The prosecution hammered again and again at the theme of his supposed recklessness. Each page of so-called evidence another nail in the coffin of his reputation, with most objections overruled. Adamant. He felt aged beyond the hours past, stacking his papers without a glance at Alina and in the corridor. The bite of the winter air was interrupted by her voice, David, and she stood a few paces away. Her lawyer already descending the decana steps, her composure cracking for a fleeting moment as she insisted she was not doing this to hurt him. His laugh dry and humorless, asked what else it could be, and she, eyes shifting, murmured it was to protect her children, to which he replied, they are our children, Alina. But she only turned and walked away, leaving him in the cold with papers that accused him of acts he had not committed. In that moment, he made a silent vow to uncover the truth, to expose Mark's role, and to ensure his children knew their father had never stopped fighting for them. Yet the court had heard only half the story, and in battles like this, truth was simply another weapon. On the morning of the final hearing, the courtroom smelt faintly of varnished wood and stale coffee, but carried with it a heavier air, for now it was not merely about money, but blood. David sat at the defendant's table, fingers gripping its edge as if to keep it from slipping away. Alina across the aisle smoothing the cuff of her blouse without meeting his gaze. And between them a small void, the empty seats were Lily. And Noah might have sat had the judge permitted it. The bailiffs, booming all rise, ushered in Judge Matthews, who looked older, burdened by the decision ahead. Alina's solicitor rose first, declaring that custody was not about wealth but stability, safety, and love, painting her as the children's constant, the one at every conference, appointment, and recital, while portraying David as emotionally absent, financially questionable, and frequently away. Photographs of Lily's 8th birthday with his empty chair, concert programs where his name had been scratched out, and apologetic text messages were displayed, each a silent blade true in occurrence, false in implication for his absences, had been in service of securing their future, but motives leave no paper trail. When his turn came, David's counsel acknowledged his imperfections but emphasized his sacrifices, producing pictures of camping trips, receipts for art supplies and school outings, proof of quiet, consistent care. The court-appointed guardian A kindly-eyed woman named Abigail gave a balanced yet unflinching report, praising both parents, yet warning of the damaging breakdown in their communication. David testified simply he loved his children beyond life, believed he had been a responsible father, and provided them with a safe home, but under cross-examination was pressed about missed birthdays and school events. Forced to admit to them, knowing how they would be heard, Alina followed clinical until speaking of the children's sadness, then softening. And when asked if joint custody was possible, she answered no, not if the current hostility remained. Then, in an unusual move, the judge had them speak to him directly without lawyers. David spoke of wanting his children to feel loved in both homes, to have both parents present at milestones, to grow up strong despite their parents' separation. Alina, eyes bright, spoke of wanting them to feel safe, to sleep without hearing arguments, to grow up believing love does not hurt. The judge listened in silence, his face unreadable, the weight of the decision hanging over them both like an unspoken sentence.
She could have been able to afford the mortgage on Christine's house.
If we were able to pay off the land this year, then why wouldn't we be able to actually just fund your construction?
The courthouse that morning did not simply stand as a building of stone and pillars, but as a sentinel of impending judgment. Looming over all who dared to enter, its vast steps cold beneath the feet of those whose lives were about to be dismantled, or reassembled by the decisions within. The light outside was a dull pewter, the kind of gray that seemed to seep into bones. A reluctant dawn casting no warmth, only an indifferent illumination upon the faces of the few gathered beyond the doors. Inside, the lobby's polished floor reflected the slow, anxious pacing of people with purposes both noble and nefarious, their footsteps mingling with the muted shuffle of papers and the occasional metallic ping of the lift doors. David entered, alone, the weight of the weeks before clinging to him like a damp shroud. His coat collar was pulled slightly high, though not for the cold. It was a habit he had taken on since the trial began. It's a way of shielding himself from the probing eyes of journalists and strangers alike. His attorney had suggested meeting outside the courtroom to prepare for the day ahead, but David had declined. He needed the silence, the moment to breathe, though breathing felt more like swallowing shards of glass now. The air had a tension in a tan, almost physical hum, the kind that makes the skin at the back of one's neck tighten. It was not the sound of idle conversation, but a restless anticipation, the atmosphere one might find before a storm tears. Through the coast, reporters moved with a predatory ease, their cameras slung like weapons, their eyes narrowing each time the elevator doors opened. David felt the inevitability of confrontation hanging over him, though he expected it to come from the same familiar direction from Alina, his estranged wife. Seated at her counsel's table with that carefully composed stillness she had perfected over the past weeks. But then his gaze caught on something, someone, and in that instant the pit of his stomach seemed to drop away entirely. Mark, his younger brother. The same brother who, for months, had been quietly maneuvering in the shadows, whispering to anyone who would listen about the supposed need to sell off the estate, dismissing David's guardianship of their father's legacy as stubborn sentimentality. Today, he was here in the flesh, walking with a kind of deliberate stride that came from rehearsed confidence, flanked by two lawyers whose immaculate suits and clipped steps betrayed the fact that they were well prepared to speak for him. Mark's suit was a sharp charcoal pressed within an inch of its life, and the knot of his tie sat in perfect, smug symmetry beneath his smirk. David's mouth went dry. What was he doing here? Up until now, the battle had been between husband and wife, between David and Alano, people who had once shared a home, a bed, a life, and now stood as adversaries before the bench. But Mark's presence here was a game changer. And David knew instinctively that his brother's role would not be that of a bystander. When the bailiff summoned all to the courtroom, David's fears were confirmed with quiet precision. Alina's attorney rose with an almost leisurely grace, allowing a faint, knowing smile to play upon their lips before addressing the judge. Your Honor, We now have a new witness who can offer crucial testimony about the estate and Mr. Grant's qualification as both guardian and trustee. We call Mark Grant to testify. The sound of the name in that setting was like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples reached David before the words had even settled into silence. His chest tightened painfully. She brought him here. Mark walked to the witness stand with a kind of assuredness only betrayal can give. His every movement speaking of someone who had imagined this day, savored it, perhaps even dreamt of it in those quiet, scheming hours when resentment tastes sweet. He took the oath, sat and leaned forward towards the microphone as though it were an old friend, ready to help him spill truths and poison alike. His voice, when it came, was steady, carrying just enough earnestness to appear credible. Brother David has always been ambitious, he began, and David knew at once that what followed would not be praise. But ambition can cloud judgment. I've seen him take speculative investments, refuse reasonable offers to sell portions of the estate, and ignore the advice of family. He's withheld financial records from other heirs. In my view, his hold on the estate isn't about honoring our father's legacy. It's about control. And if he's willing to risk our inheritance, how can we trust him with our well-being? A collective intake of breath rolled through the gallery like a gust of wind over dry grass. David's lawyer shot to his feet, voice firm and unyielding. Mr. Grant, is it correct that you personally approached several real estate investors to offer them the estate for sale? Mark hesitated, the first crack in his poise. Yes, and is it also the case that you stood to gain personally from those sales? That's not yes or no, Mr. Grant. Yes. The lawyer pressed on, sensing the shift. So you have a personal financial stake in declaring my client unfit to control the estate? Mark's smile faltered into something tighter, but he clung to it. That's not why I'm here. No, the attorney replied smoothly. You're here because my client wouldn't sell our father's legacy to the highest bidder. And you've chosen to side with his estranged wife to drive him out completely. The room buzzed like a hive kicked from its tree. Still, Elena did not move. She didn't look at David, didn't look at Mark. Her stillness was its own verdict. David could hardly look away from her, recalling with painful clarity the dinners where she had rolled her eyes at Mark's grandiose business pitches. The times she had laughed at his get-rich-quick schemes. Okay? Now she sat there, allowing him to drive the knife in. Judge Matthews slammed his gavel for order, his voice slicing through the tension. This is a hearing on custody and estate management, not a family squabble. Keep your responses pertinent. But the harm was done. Words once spoken in that room had a way of settling into the judge's mind like dust into the grooves of old wood. They did not leave easily during recess. David confronted Mark in the hallway, voice low and sharp. You think siding with her will get you what you want? Mark's smirk returned, as if it had never left. It's not about what I want, it's about what Dad would have wanted. And he wouldn't have wanted you running everything into the ground. David stepped closer, his tone a blade's edge. You've never cared about the land? You've always cared about beating me. Mark didn't deny it, perhaps. But at least I'm honest about it. Before David could reply, the bailiff called them back in. This time, Elena's lawyer produced a sheaf of printed emails, which David recognized instantly. They were exchanges between him and the property manager discussing the possibility of leveraging part of the estate as collateral for a loan. Yes, he had explored that option, but it had been for emergency repairs to the big farmhouse after a storm had torn away part of the roof. Without the repairs, tenants would have been forced out. In the hands of Elena's counsel, the emails were stripped of their context, reduced to a damning narrative of secrecy and financial recklessness. Mr. Grant, the lawyer asked pointedly, did you intend on informing your brother or your wife about this loan? It wasn't settled. There was nothing to share yet. The lawyer's smile thinned into something almost cruel. Or was it something you didn't want them to hear? The heat between counsel boiled over until both sides were talking. over each other, voices rising like opposing tempests. Judge Matthews banged his gavel again, the sharp report echoing off the walls. I will not allow this courtroom to turn into a circus. If either side tries to undermine these proceedings with frivolous personal grudges, I will hold them in contempt. Silence followed, but it was the brittle kind that bends before it breaks. David knew then that this was no longer about truth. It was about winning. When the day's session ended, he lingered in the vacated courtroom, eyes fixed on the witness, stand where his brother had sat and spoken words that could never be unsaid. Divorce was one thing. Marriages could end. But family was meant to be impenetrable, a fortress against the world. Now the lines had been drawn. His wife and his brother stood together, and he stood alone. Friends, this is Meerab. And you've been watching Starspill USA, your #1 destination for the most gripping sister wives news, emotional updates, and all the untold truths behind the Brown family drama. Here, we dive deeper than the headlines, bringing you heartfelt storytelling, shocking revelations, and the kind of detail you won't find anywhere else. If you've been moved by today's story, make sure to stay tuned, because on Starspill USA, the drama never sleeps, and neither do we when it comes to bringing you the real story.